How's it going, everybody? Welcome to RobertArms. My name is Rob, and I'm the host of this channel. If you're unfamiliar with this subject, it's called Gun Anatomy, where I discuss the origins and mechanisms of common and uncommon weapon platforms. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started right now. The weapon I'm going to be talking about today is a proven combat system from the late 40s originating from the Soviet Union. It's every boomer's favorite weapon they bought for $50 and tried to flip for an attempted $1,000 profit at your local gun show. And more often than not, they are horribly modified by some guy named Bubba. Not that guy. The weapon I'm referring to is the Russian SKS. The Simonov carbine, or simply known as the SKS, is a semi-automatic, short-stroke gas piston system with a tilting bolt and an internal 10-round magazine chambered in 7.62 by 39mm, originating from the Soviet Union. This somewhat crudely built but handy carbine was manufactured by the Soviets from 1949 to 1958 and was manufactured by many of the Soviets' prospective allies, especially China. Its manufacturing numbers range between 5 to 15 million. In other words, there's a shit ton of them out there. Even though these rifles were only in a limited official capacity with the Soviet Army slowly being replaced with the AK, it saw an extensive service history with many countries all over the world since its inception, and it was noted to be very reliable during the harshest of combat conditions. This weapon gained notoriety in conflicts like the Vietnam War and the situations in the Middle East, where many militants often need a cheap, reliable carbine to be used for guerrilla warfare operations, which it most certainly did. When the Soviet Union fell in 1993, huge, vast stockpiles of these weapons, along with the Chinese firearm manufacturing industry, flooded the US gun market with these weapons, and they were often sold for dirt cheap due to $0 manufacturing cost, because most of the factories at the time that made these weapons were state-owned. There's one good thing the commies did was make cool firearms cheap for a good while. The SKS became its own popular icon and became the first military rifle owned by many here in the US for that very reason. This is all due to the genius of its designer, which leads to my next segment, the lore. If you want to skip this portion of the video, I'll label a timestamp below in the description that'll skip you to the part where I talk about how this weapon works on the inside. The SKS was invented by Sergei Simonov. Simonov started his firearms career at the Kovrov plant in 1917, working on the Madsen MG production line until the whole program fell apart due to revolutionary reasons. His aptitude for firearm design and his cleverness caught the attention of several high personnel at the plant, and he was soon paired and apprenticed under several key firearm designers like Vasily Degtyarev and Fyodor Tokarev. Sometime after the Russian Civil War in 1926, Simonov would create his first ever prototype under the tutorship of one Vladimir Fedorov. You would know Fedorov as the man who invented the Fedorov Automat, an early select-fire battle rifle. The Simonov prototype was deemed unusable by his superiors for military service and was shot down, but served as an interesting footnote in developing his skill set for later designs. By the 1930s, the Soviet Union would invest heavily into modernizing its infantry weapons, and inventors like Simonov would be transferred to the Tula Arms plant to partake in a new semi-automatic rifle development program. Out of the weapons developed in that trial, Simonov's weapon would stand out amongst the competition with the exception of Tokarev for a key reason. Most of the weapons that were sent in at the time for test trials were often recoil-operated and unreliable. His design used a short-stroke gas piston system, which was unseen or unheard of at the time. Simonov's design would eventually be adopted by the Soviet Army in 1936, and that weapon would be called the AVS-36. Once the weapon entered service for a few years, it became very apparent that there were problems with this weapon right from the get-go. Soldiers would often complain that due to the construction of the weapon, when dirt would get into the system, it would complicate things and often cause the weapon to jam up. The weapon would sometimes be deemed unreliable in freezing combat conditions due to the cosmoline grease that they would be shipped in from the factory, and more often than not locking up the complex system. When the weapons would be captured by the Finns during the Winter War, they noted the same problem. And even though the weapon was designed to be select fire, automatic fire was deemed impractical due to the high recoil impulse of 7.62 by 54R and unreliable feeding, possibly due to dimensional issues with the rimmed cartridge in the magazine. By the beginning of World War II, around 1940, the AVS-36 would cease production, and Tokarev's design, the SVT-38, and later the SVT-40, would be chosen for mass production for Soviet troops throughout World War II. And this was mostly a political decision because of a relationship between Tokarev and Stalin, not so much a practical reason because the SVT had its own issues. By late 1940, this setback would cause Simonov to draw up new designs for a semi-auto rifle that would later become the early SKS prototypes, and these design principles would prove pivotal in his next adopted weapon. By 1941, the Germans would begin their invasion of the Soviet Union under codename Operation Barbarossa, and the Soviets would be absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of armor being used against them. Soviet planners knew that a huge gap of anti-tank weaponry in the military needed to be addressed, and they delivered the monumental task to Simonov and another inventor, Degtyarev, to create new anti-tank rifles to stop the German advance. Luckily for Simonov, he had already drawn up an anti-tank rifle based on the principles of his SKS prototypes. This weapon would be hastily adopted as the PTRS-41 anti-tank rifle chambered in the monstrous 14.5 by 114mm round, and it would be used heavily across the Eastern Front throughout the duration of the Second World War against light German panzers and armored vehicles. Using a 5-round en-bloc clip, it would be loaded into an internal magazine, and the short-stroke gas piston and simple trigger mechanism made the weapon basic enough for good maintenance and reliability in combat conditions, ideal for a military weapon. Later in the war, the Soviets would discover the new intermediate cartridges that the Germans were using in their STG-44 assault rifle, and would later develop the 7.62 by 39mm cartridge for standardized adoption, but would need new rifles to be designed around this new caliber. Later in World War II, it would be self-evident that Simonov would begin to scale down his PTRS-style design into a new infantry rifle based on this new cartridge. By the end of World War II in 1945, this would all culminate into the design we know now today as the SKS-45, or simply the SKS, and it would be formally adopted by the Soviet Army to replace its aging Mosin Nagants and SVT-40 rifles. It would feature an internal magazine loaded with 10-round stripper clips and would also have a folding bayonet. I like doing that. This weapon's accuracy and reliable action made it a very effective weapon, but would slowly be replaced in the Soviet Army with the more practical AK. But despite that, it would see heavy use throughout the conflicts of the Cold War and in the modern conflicts in the Middle East. It would go down in history as one of the greatest combat weapons of the mid-20th century. Oh nice, you made it to the end. I hope you guys enjoyed that segment. If there's anything I missed, go ahead and leave it in the comments. And I'll cite some sources down below for you guys to research that stuff if you want to learn more about the development of this weapon. Without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about how this weapon works on the inside. The SKS operates with a short-stroke gas piston system and a tilting bolt. The shooter begins by opening the breech and locking the bolt on the hold-open latch. Rounds are inserted via stripper clip or by hand into the internal magazine until it reaches 10 rounds, depressing the follower and releasing the pressure against the hold-open latch. The bolt carrier is then pulled back, then released, charging forward to chamber a round. The shooter disengages the flip safety and presents. When the trigger is pulled, the trigger bar and trigger spring move at the same time, clearing the sear for the hammer against pressure of the trigger spring, swinging, striking the back of the firing pin, hitting the primer, and igniting the gunpowder, launching the projectile via explosive gases through the bore. Gases are rerouted through the porthole on the barrel into the gas block. The pressure forces the piston rod rearward, acting against the spring-loaded piston rod extension. The piston rod extension pushes the bolt carrier rearward, forcing the bolt to tilt upwards and unlock itself from its recess. The extractor pulls the empty shell from the breech and is ejected, and the follower moves the next cartridge into position. As the bolt carrier moves rearward along the recoil guide rod and spring, the hammer tilts back, and the latch sear spring pushes the sear under the hammer. When the bolt carrier bounces against the recoil spring, it moves forward, feeding the next cartridge into the chamber. Once the next round is chambered, the bolt tilts and locks into its recess, and it depresses the disconnector lever, forcing the trigger bar into reset, ready to start the process all over again. Well, I guess that wraps things up. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave a like, comment, and share if you thought this video was interesting or entertaining, so you can help the channel grow. If you guys are interested in seeing what's going on with the channel, go ahead and check out my Instagram profile at RobertArms Official. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, stay safe, and I hope to see y'all in the next video.